I'm not against people using hormones. I know some women get their quality of life back when they use them. Wherever our hormones come from inside of us, or if they're synthetic or bioidentical, whether it's from the pill, whether it's from hormone replacement therapy, wherever they're coming from, you have to be able to detoxify them and eliminate them. It doesn't matter where they come from, but you need great liver and gut function to detoxify hormones so you can get rid of them, because problems arise if we recycle them.
Hey, good friend, your engagement makes these episodes possible. So if you're enjoying this content, please engage in any means necessary. What if the way that we eat, think, and move through our day is quietly impacting our biochemistry? Today's guest has spent decades helping us understand that very connection. From the gut to the brain, from hormones to habits, from science to soul. Dr. Libby Weaver is a nutritional biochemist, best-selling author of 14 books, including 7 bestsellers, and her latest, Fix Iron First. She is one of the most beloved voices in women's health. Her work translates complex science into wisdom that changes how we live, restore, eat, and care for ourselves. In this conversation, we explore her journey from the lab to the retreat space, the hidden costs of busyness, why iron might just be the most overlooked nutrient in our time, and how discipline, habit, and heart can reshape our well-being. So settle in. This one's equal parts science, art, and soul. I know I really enjoyed this episode, and it might just give you permission to pause, to nourish, and to thrive. Enjoy. Dr. Libby, welcome to the Adventures in Wellbeing podcast. So nice to see you live in this digital world.
Damian, thank you so much for having me join you. I'm so thrilled.
I wanted to start, you have a PhD in biochemistry. Take us back to that woman. You're in school, you're studying that world of academics and what you would have envisaged as your path and your future. What did that girl think she was going to do, and what did she hope she was going to do? How would she reflect on who you've become?
Oh, what a glorious question to open. Thank you. I didn't ever imagine I would do a PhD in biochemistry. I did chemistry at high school, but I had a tutor. But as soon as I got to university and studied nutrition and dietetics, suddenly chemistry all made sense because it connected to something that I cared about very much, which was preventing unnecessary suffering. It was connecting it to human health and human nutrition. So at the end of my first degree in nutrition and dietetics, I actually did a placement in a hospital in regional Australia in a country town. And I had the privilege of running the outpatient clinic there. So seeing people who weren't terribly sick, but they weren't that well either, but they weren't in a life-threatening situation. And I saw 3 children across my time there and made dietary changes to them, and they got better. And some of them had had a huge amount of medical attention with, and they'd been investigated for everything from leukemia to, all sorts of really serious conditions. And yet dietary change brought them their outcome. And so I couldn't understand, as there I was as essentially a student dietitian at the time, how was what I was doing making the difference in these children's lives, and when they'd had so much medical attention. And that led me to make a phone call to the man who'd been my immunology professor in my undergraduate degrees, and I told him what I'd observed. And he said, "You've got a very curious mind, you should do a PhD." And I said, "Oh no, I'm terrible at science. I'm a people person. I need to be with people." And he said, "No, all you need for a science-based research PhD is curiosity and a big question you want to answer." So it was because of that chat that I went down that road, and I learned more through my time doing that PhD than I could ever have imagined, in that I worked with children, with families, with children with autism spectrum disorder. And I want to put that in context because it was back in a time where the diagnostic criteria for that condition was very narrow. So these were children who were predominantly non-verbal. They're not toilet trained. They were probably not really ever be able to hold down a relationship, live independently. So they were children who were severely affected. And I was working on improving their bowel, essentially their gut health through that PhD. And it was a most extraordinary privilege to work with those families and learn so much, not just about human health, but about relationships. And it helped really clarify things that mattered to me as well. So I came out of that a very different human being and very grateful for the experience.
The diagnosis of autism has skyrocketed. It's a broader kind of spectrum now, isn't it? What have you learned and what have we learned about the origin and why that's happening or what is happening? And you were already paying attention to the gut and diet. Has that evolved?
Yes, it has. It was back in the 1990s when I was doing that work. It took me 2 years to get ethics approval. We didn't even have the word gut microbiome back then. We used to call it gut bacteria profiles. And the reason I wanted to go down that pathway was because in my clinical practice doing nutrition work, I wasn't trying to treat autism. I was just trying to help the children have better gut health, essentially, because so many of them had severe constipation or severe diarrhea. A lot of the children were quite malnourished. They weren't able to absorb the nutrients from the foods they were consuming, plus their diets were typically very, very narrow. So they might only eat white food or brown food, or they might only eat 3 different foods and no more than that. So I was trying to simply work on their nutrition, and what I observed was, not for all of them, but for some of the children, some of the symptoms that were connected with their autism diagnosis would improve just from my observation. And I was so convinced that the gut was involved in some way, not necessarily causative, but certainly contributing to the cluster of symptoms that a lot of the children really struggled with. And the very first child I worked with, he was 4 and he was nonverbal. He'd never spoken. And we made a change to his diet. And 4 days later, his mother phoned me in tears saying he had a little chair that he used to sit on, and he picked it up and he'd said, "Mummy, my chair." And there was no baby talk. There was no babble. And that was, not every child responds so distinctly to dietary change, but that was the first one. And I felt it was a nudge from the universe saying, there's something in this, keep going. And it was very hard to get ethics approval, though, because the University Ethics Committee kept saying there's no evidence for what you're trying to do. But I'd seen it in my clinical practice, and I was wanting to measure the gut bacteria, assess compounds in the children's urine, assess aspects of their blood. Yeah, eventually we got there, and there were some very distinct changes in the gut microbiome. And the way that's now obviously improved is that it's one of the first things now that's thought of. It was this movement towards helping the children with their metabolic health, with their gut health, to see if that would make a difference. And as I said, some children are highly responsive to dietary change and some less so, but it's always worth trying to improve anyone's quality of life. So yeah, it was a joy.
Wow. I mean, this is quite close to me. My nephew is on the spectrum. He's more on the functional side of the spectrum. When he was young and we noticed, we were wanting to look at diet, and it's still, certainly it wasn't being prescribed. It wasn't coming through the medical system that we should pay attention to what he was eating. And yet we were paying attention to it a bit. So to somebody listening who is close to or has a child that's autistic, if they haven't taken the first steps, what would be the first places to start in terms of seeing how much value there is in diet?
Initially looking at it as a 4-week block of time as a trial, because then it won't feel so overwhelming. Because if the child currently eats in such a narrow way, the idea of making any sort of change for the family can just feel almost impossible. So you sort of put a hat on that, okay, we're going to just try this for 4 weeks and see how we go, and then let's sit back and reflect. There's no failure with this. It's just, let's just give it a go. And after 4 weeks, reflect. So the first thing is, if the child has had recurrent, what I call streptococcus-based infection, so if they've had recurrent ear infections, I've met children, they're 2 years old and they've had 20 rounds of antibiotics prior to 2 years of age, their gut microbiome is smashed.
Cooked.
So if they've had recurrent ear infections with antibiotic treatment, or they've had tonsillitis, that's also a streptococcus-based infection, recurrent tonsillitis, croup, bronchitis. So as a cluster, I sort of call it the wet, mucousy, sort of mouth-breathing sort of experience, which sounds delightful, doesn't it?
And
sort
familiar.
Of the clinical. Yeah, that's the past. If that's the case for the child, then trialing a super strict casein-free, so dairy-free way of eating super, super strictly for 4 weeks to see if that makes a difference, if they have that really strong strep history as a background. If they don't have that, if they look dry, their skin sort of looks dry, if there's a strong Irish heritage in the family, if there's a history of autoimmune conditions, then I would trial a super strict gluten-free way of eating. I didn't ever do both at the same time because I wanted to see what made a difference. Because if you remove both and it makes a difference, you don't know if is it one or is it both. So I always did one at a time for the child's benefit because it's less change all at once, but also for the family so they can actually observe if it's actually making a difference. If there's no difference after the 4-week super strict trial, you bring it back. But within 4 weeks, usually you know. And one of the paths that actually led me to do this PhD as well was my flatmate when I was at university doing my undergraduate degree. She was studying to become an art teacher and she went to uni about 8 or 10 hours a week. And to do nutrition and dietetics, we were there about 30 or 32 hours a week. And so she and I used to laugh about that. Years later, she moved to Melbourne and I was still in Newcastle in New South Wales doing my PhD. And she didn't really know what I was doing, but she saw a story in the Melbourne Age in the newspaper and the heading said milk linked to brain disorders. And it's a silly story because when she and I were flatmates, if I liked a boy and he didn't like me back, to try to make me feel better, she used to say, oh, don't worry, he has a brain disorder. It was just her little silly way of like, it's okay if he doesn't like you back. So she just saw this heading in the newspaper and sent it to me and said, this must have been what was wrong with all the boys who never liked you.
Nice.
But it was actually the research of an American professor who was finding fragments of food in the spinal fluid of adults with schizophrenia and children with autism. And the fragments of food were coming from casein, from dairy foods, and gluten that's in wheat, rye, barley, oats, and triticale, so those grains. Mm-hmm. And please know this doesn't happen in everyone. There's all sorts of things that have to go awry for these little tiny peptides derived from these foods to end up in spinal fluid. And we know then that they can bind to the opioid receptors in the brain and give us pleasure and block pain experiences. So that's a whole other story. But that was the origin of why I was trialing gluten and dairy-free ways of eating with these children, was because of that research back in the 1990s. And yes, it was pretty obscure back then, but that's where I would start.
I remember the late 90s, early 2000s, if you said you were gluten intolerant, first of all, it was almost unheard of. And second of all, if you happened to figure it out, people would have thought you were an alien. I remember a lot of people kind of felt like it was made up, like people were just kind of making up these little dietary things and they were a bit obsessive and overreacting and the whole thing. So you've mentioned dairy and you've mentioned gluten. Do you think that those foods, for most of us, maybe who aren't extremely allergic to either one, do you think that those foods in particular should be avoided for the general population? Or is it individual and we just have these specific cases of humans who should avoid one or the other?
I think it's individual. I also think it's the form that the foods come in. So, for example, I'll use Sweden as an example, or even to European countries. I've had many patients over the years who an adult might get a skin rash from, say, dairy products down under, or the person who lives down under might get severely constipated when they eat gluten. And then when they go to Europe and eat the dairy foods or the gluten-containing foods there, that doesn't happen. I don't say that because I heard that from 1 or 2 people. That was hundreds of people who would come back and share those experiences. So Is it the way we process it? Is it the bread over there is fermented for 36 or 72 hours? The grains are fermented and no extra gluten is added. So there's so much I think we still don't know, and it's probably, is it related to pesticides? Who knows? It's, a big can of worms, and I don't think we're clear yet on what it is that can be so disruptive for some people when they eat those foods to their digestive system. I don't think we know yet. So right now I would just say you suss it out on an individual level.
I've heard the same thing, actually, this difference between European grains or heritage grains and what we're eating, which is, potentially more GMO and more processed and those sorts of things. And so Do you, kind of stepping outside of the scientific or the research-based decisions that I imagine you're often making, do you make decisions for yourself or to your mom and dad? Do you kind of go, hey, here's what I think we should be doing? Like, what's the personal choice?
The personal choice, I want to call them fads. And there's often a lot of, and I'm going to put the word evidence in inverted commas, because when I was at university, we were taught that a low-fat, high in complex carbohydrate way of eating was the way to go. And so that was considered evidence-based. And for a lot of people through that time, their health did not go that well. Some people will describe they thrive eating that way, but for many people, their health didn't go that well through that period of time. And so I paid attention to that and thought the way to not get caught up in fads, or even sometimes what we're told there's a lot of evidence for, is to trust nature. So right now, for me, there's no such thing as junk food. There's just junk and there's food. And at the moment, we call food whole real food, but it's just food. And as humans, it's all we've ever eaten up until the very recent past. So my personal philosophy is I eat food. I don't eat junk, not because I'm trying to limit myself or deprive myself. I'm just not interested in it. It doesn't even enter my head. I love to grow food. That's something that I care about hugely. And it's not just the growing of the food and providing it. I am connected to food in the privilege that it is, because I'm very aware that still not everyone in the world has access to nutritious food or enough food and clean drinking water. I live with awareness of that every day. And I think about those things while I water my own garden in the evening. And so it's nourishing myself is not just with real food, but it's with awareness of the gift of that. And that also I get to choose what I eat. I have enough money that I can buy food.
Yeah, it is an enormous gift, and also a gift that many of us don't really realize we have. I mean, I know sometimes I say here at Aroha, I say, if all you did was come here and change your diet, you will feel an enormous shift. Most people will anyways. And yet, we do all of these different layers together. But I often say it when somebody's kind of hard on themselves because they haven't completed a hike or they didn't go to Pilates or whatever it is. I'm like, don't worry. We're doing so much. You're going to feel great. Just hang in there. It seems like you've kind of turned your focus towards women with rushing women's syndrome. And now you've kind of continued in that journey. Yeah. Catch us up. What was the jump between autism and diet and women's health?
You're so lovely to notice that, Damian. So at the end of the second year of uni, when you present all the data you've collected, what you've done that year, and you have to present that to the faculty. So it's a room filled with medical professionals, scientists, and my professor from the back of the room popped his hand up pretending he was going to ask a question. And I called on him and he said, okay, that's great. So now that you've told all of us in the room, I now want you to pretend a camera from the 6 o'clock news is right in your face and you've got to translate what you just said for ordinary people to be able to understand it. So he completely put me on the spot to make me translate my data to layman's terms, if you like. And I did it. And I had such a moment after I did that that made me realize that it's all wasted if it just stays in that academic world. Mm-hmm. And like I said, I can't bear unnecessary suffering. And I see so much unnecessary suffering from people not treating themselves with kindness, with consideration, with treating themselves like the precious person that they are. And a part of that is then not caring about what they eat and what they nourish, not just their body with, but their mind, their soul. I saw so much unnecessary suffering and thought, I want to do something to mitigate, alleviate that if I can. I want to contribute to that. And so that made me sort of move away from that academic research focus to, I'm going to translate this into real world terms. And one of the first jobs I got after that was working in a health retreat where, as you live and breathe every day, people come because they're trying to change something about themselves or enhance their quality of life or have some space, some time out, or they might be grieving, or they might want to improve their fitness. There's 1,000 reasons why someone would seek to go to a health retreat. But that was where I had a lot of very deep and meaningful conversations with people who were otherwise strangers and got a real insight into what we were starting to talk about as stress. Because again, back then, the conversations around stress and its impact on health, they were really only just starting. And it was when I was first in that health retreat world, it was still very much burn off as many calories as you can by annihilating yourself with exercise and not so much nurturing, nourishing. I used to say back then, what you resist is what you need. So the people who wanted to just sort of do nothing, I felt that sometimes they probably needed to remind themselves of how strong they actually were, whereas the people who wanted to just go hard, they probably just needed to lie around and read a book for a day. It was so I started to see a whole different part of human psychology play out with stress, and so that led me very much down that women's health road, and seeing the impacts of things like chronic iron deficiency, living with that relentless sort of rush, go, go, looking at what was happening with the digestive system, with reproductive hormones, with thyroid function. Yeah, so going, hugely into that whole endocrine sort of picture that I ended up writing a book about, as you said, called Rushing Woman Syndrome. So essentially, I can't bear unnecessary suffering. And that's why I went in that direction.
You've got like a monk's heart in there that can't unbear unnecessary suffering. It's such a beautiful way to look at the world. And yet, of course, so much to carry also with this world. Tell me a little bit of the difference between the biochemistry that I experience as a human and what you experience as a human. What are the major differences and what's the value in kind of teasing those apart?
So I was very, observant of women's psychology of rushing woman syndrome so that I could address that. So I'll speak to that first and then to men. So I'm 51 now, and I wrote that book when I was in my early 30s, and I was really writing it for women who were around my age, essentially, because they were women who were often had jobs or careers that they really loved and cared about and wanted to excel at and be great at. They also often had families who they loved deeply and cared about and wanted to be there for and with. Now people could get hold of you in about 5 different ways instead of just one over the phone. And we forget that when we used to leave the house, no one could get hold of us, and you had to sort of be back at home or at an office before anyone could actually get in touch with you again. We forget that life used to be like that. And the reason I bring that to life when I'm talking about the difference, both for men and for women, is that unless we actively chose to not take our phones with us, or we turned them off, or we put them on silent, or we turned off the notifications, we were contactable all the time. So there was no space. Because if you think about when before that, even if you were in your car, stopped at red traffic lights, you might have had the radio on or a cassette on, but you looked at the sky or you looked at the trees, or you might think about what you were worried about and try and find some solutions to the things that were bothering you, or you thought, need to write a letter or ring someone because I miss them or I care about them. Whereas, once the phone's beside you, you just watch people even these days sit in a cafe. They don't just sit there and look around and have a think or, ponder what they're worried about or what they're grateful for. They're just on their phone. So the space disappeared, and there's a lot to be said for that. And I think in health retreat situations like the glorious one you provide, that's one of the huge healing factors that is on offer in a space like that, because there is space and the reconnection with nature. So I feel that all crowded in on us, and that space and the observation of nature, I feel that became narrower for both men and women. But add on top of into the women's scenario with rushing woman syndrome, a lot of women my age were raised to be good girls. It was literally spoken about in the home with the best of intentions from parents. You put everybody else's needs ahead of your own. It was literally taught to us. So this very self-sacrificing, be of service to others. So much of our identity can get tied up in that. And there's a lot of beauty that comes from that, because you foster beautiful friendships, you foster real kindness in your community, and the world will fall apart if we stop caring about other people and demonstrating that kindness to others. So I'm not putting that down. But I found it really interesting that there were some women who could truly give and be of service and not become depleted themselves. And there were others who lived in servitude. So they were basically prepared to destroy their own health, to show others, to prove to others that they were kind or thoughtful or selfless. And yet other women didn't, that they weren't depleted in their giving. So I was looking into the psychology of that.
That's fascinating. What did you find? What was the difference between those two women?
When the giving is connected to purpose, it was very different. Whereas when women felt like it was forced upon them and they were living almost to keep their mothers happy or their fathers happy without realizing they were doing that. So it wasn't actually authentic. It was almost like society prescribed that they needed to do it, or their family structure, family model insisted that they operate like that, or love or approval would be withdrawn. Then that was one of the key differences. Whereas for others, when it came from a genuine, I love you, I care about you, you matter, it was of genuine service. That was very energizing rather than depleting. That was one of the differences.
I'm kind of connecting to that within myself, and just like I notice that when I give what I can give and I need nothing in return, and I feel like what I've given is enough, I can give endlessly, right? Like I'm not depleted by that experience. And I certainly also have the experience where I feel like I haven't done enough. There's so much to do. There's so many this, and I have to do that. And there's this subtle, I guess, psychological weight that I carry along with what I'm doing. And yeah, I mean, it can take me to the brink of exhaustion, you know. Tell me a little bit about how hormones play into all this. I'm quite interested, like, should I work at it from the psychology, you know, from the inside out, or should I be like, oh, I wonder if my hormones are off?
I feel it's a two-way street, and they feed each other, those two scenarios. So let's unpack both the men and the women, because it is one of the differences with stress with men and women. So we'll do the men first. So men and women make testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. We just make them in different amounts, obviously, based on whether a man or a woman. And so the beginning of that biochemical pathway is cholesterol. And so cholesterol gets converted into a big silly word that no one needs to remember called pregnenolone, and then pregnenolone becomes progesterone in both men and women. But then there's a fork in the biochemical pathway where progesterone either gets converted into testosterone, estrogen, or cortisol. Cortisol obviously is a powerful anti-inflammatory. Will overproduce it in chronic stress scenarios. That's the pathway. So when the hypothalamus in our brain is observing that there's stress, essentially, the hypothalamus says to the pituitary gland, we're not safe. And the pituitary then says to the adrenals, the ovaries in women, the testes in men, the thyroid, we're not safe, respond accordingly. And so when the body is getting the message that there's chronic stress, you can imagine that biochemical pathway, cholesterol, pregnenolone, progesterone, the progesterone is going to convert hugely into cortisol when there's the perception of stress for men or women. And then that can have changes to our physiology, our immunology. So cortisol is a catabolic hormone. It very slowly breaks muscles down. So it can change metabolic rate. We end up with less muscle mass, more body fat. It changes it can sort of signal to where we store fat. We tend to thicken our torso when we have chronically long-term elevated cortisol, because it means there's no food left in the world. That's historically what it meant. And so the body thinks it's doing you a favor by protecting all of your organs that are housed in there through the famine that it thinks you're living through. Chronically elevated cortisol can start to dysregulate blood glucose regulation. It can start to disrupt a robust immune response. But you can also imagine that because that pathway is being pushed to cortisol, it can compromise in a man testosterone production. And men need testosterone not just for their muscles and their strength and their libido, but also for happiness, for purpose, hugely linked to motivation as well. So life quality, if testosterone is not as good as it could be, can be compromised because the body's getting the message to mostly produce cortisol. So a man in that situation will have changes in his body composition and in his strength, but also usually in his happiness. Men are getting better, I think, at communicating when they're having a really hard time. I think they're getting better at seeking support. We still have a long way to go with that. But sadly, if a man actually goes to a conventional sort of medical situation for that, he'll usually be given an antidepressant. There's often not a conversation around what's deeply troubling him, and the biochemistry that I've just described is usually not considered. And so if he's given an antidepressant, he doesn't have a deficiency of that. He's producing too much cortisol and not enough testosterone. And so the treatment won't work, the medicine won't work. And then a man usually tends to go to I've noticed they go to a pattern of creating a story that they're a failure in some way. And so then that
even when they're on an antidepressant.
Yeah. So then even the medicine doesn't work for me. And then they'll often not get further help and they'll just put up with that and live like that. And then you can imagine if they are in a family situation, an intimate relationship, or even in friendships, they can become very withdrawn. They don't help as much. They don't contribute as much. And then that can foster all sorts of frustration in a family situation, all coming from the fact that he's essentially really depleted. That's sort of how I see chronic rushing playing out for men. That's one of the big things.
And so that scenario is coming from, stress created from perceptions of the world, from tech, from whatever it is. So in a sense, I think what you walked us through was kind of thoughts, beliefs, mind first, affecting hormones, and then playing out. Are there common scenarios today that are the other way around, where I might be eating something or some environmental toxin is doing it the other way around?
Absolutely. And both versions exist in this world. So zinc and iron are two of the key nutrients needed to actually create testosterone. They're the two most common nutritional deficiencies for both men and women in the world. Also too, but parking those nutrient deficiencies, when you live on junk and not enough actual food and there's not enough micronutrients going in, your body doesn't have the substances inside that it needs to be able to make the things that make us feel good and that give us physical strength and that repair our muscles and repair our immune system and repair our brain after a day's work. It's absolutely both ways. I get people to imagine it like every minute of every day, your body is making lots of recipes. Cake. Your body is making all these cakes and you need obviously all the ingredients to be able to make the cake. If the body doesn't have the ingredient to make the cake, to make testosterone or to make thyroid hormones, you just won't have enough. And then you feel the effects of that. So yeah, it starts with food. And obviously the more muscle we have, the better we are too at producing testosterone especially. It all feeds itself essentially. The thoughts feed the chemistry and then the other way as well.
And when you work with your clients, do you start with nutrition? If I showed up and I was blessed with the attention of you in a one-on-one kind of environment, where would you start? Let's say I was complaining, I guess, of, say, low energy and low mood, and I was interested in weight loss and, I had all the symptoms.
Yes, so food first. So I would always assess and consider what someone is eating. I love blood tests as well. So I want to see what's happening with someone's iron parameters, for example, with their zinc. I'm going to look at thyroid function. So if someone's particularly, they're trying to work on energy, I'm going to look at thyroid, iron, for example, and then, of course, their food intake. And I see nutrition, and I reflect on this sometimes, Damian, and think, is it just because that was my original training was in nutrition? But it's definitely where I go first because I feel like it's the foundation for I call the body an earth suit. I feel like it's the foundation for the structure of our earth suit because what we eat literally becomes part of us.
Would you do gut along with the bloods, or is it just symptom dependent and you would kind of take an initial, say, or your clinician would take an initial interview with somebody and then prescribe testing from there?
It depends on the person. Some people love numbers. Some people love to see a blood test and then they want to work on that. Whereas for others, they're just very content to sort of have their symptoms assessed. So whatever they've come in that they want to work on, whether it's lousy sleep, whether it's, problems with their digestive system, might be really heavy, clotty, painful periods or a really challenging transition through perimenopause, menopause. It might simply be stress, so it might be energy. So obviously so many different things. I would move them towards eating more food and less junk. I'm going to look at the effect of caffeine on the person. I don't ever say to someone, this is how much you're allowed. I try to get their own caring for themselves, their own value in their own health. I try to get them more in touch with that, awaken that, if you like, because otherwise, if instructions to do with food come from an external source, I find they don't stick for long term. Whereas when we look after what we care about, whether that's the environment, our families, our body. So if I can get someone to care, to be just a little bit more in awe of their physical self, their choices will come from a very different place. So rather than it be, I wish I never met Libby, she told me not to drink coffee, or she told me to cut back and only have one a day or something, and then they're kind of cranky about that. Or some people cry when I've asked them to take a break from coffee because they'll say it's the only pleasure I get in my day. And I have a moment there where I understand why they feel like that, but you're missing how magnificent it is. Even if there's genuine pain and even if there's genuine distress in someone's life, there's still beauty. And if you're telling yourself that coffee's your only pleasure, I'm going to gently steer them back to reconnecting with their child's laughter or the magnificence of a tree or something else that's meaningful to them. I will say to someone with coffee, with alcohol, with things like that, you know in your own heart when you're having too much of something. So I'm going to encourage you to recalibrate your choices to see if that's going to make a difference, because then it comes from, rather than I was told I wasn't allowed to do that, because very few people will stick to that long term. It's, I can see that caffeine makes my heart race and it makes me feel really anxious because I'm going through big life transition, or I'm, I've got a change in my relationship and I'm moving house and I have 3 children under 5, and caffeine, makes me race and overreact and speak in ways I later wish I hadn't, all sorts of things. And so if I cut back on that, then maybe I won't do that. Or if I take a break and I save the caffeine for when life's a little calmer after the house move or whatever it is. Yeah, so I've always tried to steer people in that direction first, because I want them to have a tangible outcome of, I made this change and now I feel better. That's what I'm seeking, those initial changes, because then someone connects to, oh, wow, I've only been at this for 4 weeks and I already feel so vastly different. So, yeah.
I'm so fascinated. I'm so glad I finally got you on this podcast. We could go so many directions. So you do a lot of retreats. We run a lot of retreats. And I've had this conversation with a few people. And often I think my clients probably have this question. So I come to a retreat, fine. I quit my coffee for a week, and fine, I'm off my phone at night before bed, and fine, I'm stretching and I'm strengthening and I'm eating whole foods and blah, blah, blah. And I do it for a week. But what good is that if I just kind of go back and I'm just going to go back to my regular life? What do you see as the value of having these sort of intensive, immersive experiences where we're held in a space and we're kind of really soaked and steeped in whatever practices or value is there?
Firstly, I think it's a reset. So you have this opportunity to break a lot of habits, whether it's related to the way you use your phone or with alcohol or caffeine, whatever exercise patterns, but it's a circuit breaker, firstly. And then at the end of a retreat experience, I think it's incredibly important to pause and to consider what made the biggest difference for you. What is your intuition saying was the most important thing? If you can't keep all of it going when you go home, which most people can't, and I understand that, what is the number one thing? What's your new non-negotiable? And it's going to be different for everyone. It might be an earlier bedtime. I feel so good getting 9 hours sleep. I'm not reverting to how I used to live. Or it might be less phone usage. So you just get a strategy around that when you're at home. Whatever the thing that wells up or has risen to the surface for them, that they commit to then continuing to do. But I like to encourage people to always put a time limit on something, because let's say it's alcohol. Let's say you get to the end of a retreat experience and you think, wow, I just slept so much better without alcohol. I'm going to keep that going. I think it's really good to say, I'm going to do that for another, pick your time, month or whatever it is, and then you reflect again. So it's this very connected practice to, I'm not just saying I'll give it up forever, because some people will, but a lot of people won't. And if in the next 4 weeks you get a social invitation to attend dinner, you can think, well, I'm not drinking at that because I've decided I'm doing it for another 4 weeks. Whereas if you haven't stipulated the time and you get invited to a dinner, you'll think, oh, this is going to happen all the time, so I may as well just drink. It's just this one night out. But then you get the taste for it back, and before you know it, it's back in your life every day. So that's why I think this blocks of time where you really commit to, I'm not doing that, and then you reflect and think, okay, how did I go with that? Oh, wow, it's getting easier. Or you might make a decision, I'm only going to drink on really special occasions. It's not going to be a feature in my everyday life anymore. You're in constant sort of, I guess, relationship and consideration of this new choice that you've decided to sustain.
When we were originally talking about taking these autistic children through getting off of dairy for a period of time and getting off of gluten for a period of time, now we're kind of talking about habit change in these blocks of time. It makes a lot of sense to me that, cognitively, to say forever is a bit heavy, right? It's like, oh my God, forever. But to give yourself a period of time, it really helps, Have you had any experience, or do you have any insights around how long, let's say for habit change, let's say you want to quit drinking, because I know a lot of people do dry July and things like that. Is a month enough time? You hear things like 21 days to create a new habit or 31 days to create a new habit. Is that enough time, or is there a period of time that you've found really works to create that hard kind of objective reset where you can look at a habit and go, do I want this in my life or not?
I think it's different for everyone. I know people for whom they'll say, it was definitely 100 days. So that with alcohol, for example, they did a month at first and then just were so astonished at how much better they felt. They thought, well, I'll just do another month, and just bit off little pieces like that. Whereas I would say that there are other people who it's still not a habit, even though they might be 5 years into, in this example, not drinking. It's an everyday, I'm not drinking today. So I feel that for some people, they would probably tell you it's never really become a habit, it's a discipline. Or and the same with exercise. I think most youthful older people I know will tell you it's a discipline because the rewards were so expansive for their experience in life, having a fit, strong, uninjured, a strong, flexible, energized body. They can't imagine life without it. Some, I think, probably would say it's a habit that took a chunk of time to establish, whereas for others, they'll say, I don't even think of it as a habit, it's a discipline. A discipline, I think, has negative connotations, but there's so much beauty in discipline. I get up in the morning and I make my bed every morning. Is that a habit? I guess, but I see it more like a discipline because...
Yeah, totally. Well, what I notice is the difference between the two, and I think this is one of the most, challenging things for all of us to manage in our health and wellness, is that it's really easy to create habits with things that are easy, delicious, addictive, etc., right? Like those habits come easy. And discipline kind of points to the things that, have delayed gratification built in. I agree. Like I still feel I try to move every day, and every day there's a little bit of friction and I have to, nudge myself in the right direction. And, I don't drink, and it's gotten easier and easier. Of course, there's some mix of habit and discipline in that, but there's still discipline in that. Yeah, I totally get that. I think it's actually a really nice differentiation. And that discipline isn't so hard when you're really clear on the immense value that you get out of something. You have a kind of grander, more holistic sense of why you're choosing what you're choosing. Discipline is the obvious choice, I think.
You crystallized a few things for me there. So thank you with what you said then about habit and discipline. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. So we touched on hormones in men. We're touching on nutrients and iron and zinc. Walk me through a little bit the difference or what's valuable for women in that arena. So that cascade through the hormone cycle, what's the difference there for women?
With women, the simplest way I can say it is almost like a compounding effect. So often when a woman starts to menstruate, it's at a time where she's more impacted than she ever has been by what I would just call diet culture. Around the time she starts to menstruate, and she becomes very aware of her body, and very sadly, too many young women still restrict their eating in some way. So they're eating to control their body shape and size rather than eating for nourishment, energy, brain function, robust health. It's this restrictive mindset. So, and with the increased iron requirements that menstruation brings, a lot of young teenagers are iron deficient. And anxiety is a symptom of iron deficiency. Anxiety can have a lot of causes, of course, but one of them is iron deficiency, and I feel like it's being hugely overlooked. So a lot of girls don't find out they're iron deficient in those teenage years, and so it often goes unaddressed, or sometimes they'll take one of the old school supplements that often drives constipation, so they don't take the medicine. They just stay iron deficient. Thankfully, there's a new generation of supplements now. I have just done one called Iconic Iron. But the iron deficiency is often there and persists. And then let's say we move out of home and suddenly, certainly I'm speaking to sort of women of my age, we moved out of home when we were 17, 18. We had to find money for bills, for rent, bus passes, whatever, for life. So there's this increase in stress hormones, and I don't know if that ever fully goes away. And it certainly kicks in more, obviously, if someone has a mortgage and they have children and aging parents and caring about the world at large. So often that feeling of stress just gets bigger and bigger. So it doesn't resolve either. And then often, certainly for a lot of women of my generation through our 20s, that was a time where you weren't so much focused on nutrition. There might have been more alcohol consumed than previously. So fatty liver can start to develop, which is very silent when it begins, but liver function is compromised when fat starts to overtake where a functional liver cell once was. And then with that change in liver function, periods become heavier. And also with changes in the gut microbiome that can come, we can end up recycling estrogen instead of efficiently detoxifying it and eliminating it in urine and feces. And if we end up recycling estrogen, our periods can become a lot heavier. Then we're losing even more iron, and your thyroid gland literally needs iron to be able to produce hormones. So let's say there's all these sort of compounding effects. So by the time someone's in their late 30s, early 40s, they don't have a disease, which is terrific, but they don't feel great. There's all of these biochemical and endocrine sort of changes going on that are suboptimal. But because it's not a disease, there's no actual treatment. So then periods are heavier, more iron loss, thyroid function's compromised. If food has not been ideal and movement has not been consistent and someone's living in a fairly sedentary way, they're often insulin resistant by midlife as well. We then bring in the next sort of part of it, which is when sex hormones start to change as someone goes through perimenopause. And there's a tendency right now in our culture to just label any suffering at midlife as perimenopause. And I'm not denying for a second that changes in sex hormones can contribute to how we feel and function and look. Of course they can. But what I'm worried about is there's just this big message right now around take hormones, use hormones, and there can be all of these things in the background, some of which can have been there since we were teenagers, that's never really been addressed. And that concerns me immensely, because if you just treat it with hormones, you miss what's there in the background, and that can cause all sorts of challenges a little bit further down the track. So that's sort of how I see women's health right now. And I'm someone who wants to get to the root, to the heart of whatever it is that's driving the challenge. I think the road in is the road out. And I feel that there's a lot that's being missed right now with women at midlife.
It's immensely popular, the hormone therapy. I certainly know I run into plenty of women who are faced with that decision or interested in whether or not to do it. Would most women who are going to their GP and complaining about menopause or perimenopausal symptoms, they're being offered hormone therapy too soon? They're not asking enough questions. The doctors don't know enough. If somebody's listening and they're kind of interested in hormone therapy or they're on hormone therapy, what would be a great step to see if they could get closer to that root cause?
Wherever our hormones come from, whether our hormones come from our own tissues, our own ovaries, our body fat, our brain, wherever our hormones come from inside of us, or if they're synthetic or bioidentical, whether it's from the pill, whether it's from hormone replacement therapy, wherever they're coming from, you have to be able to detoxify them and eliminate them. It doesn't matter where they come from, but you need great liver and gut function to detoxify hormones so you can get rid of them, because problems arise if we recycle them. So that would be the first thing. I'm not against people using hormones. I know some women get their quality of life back when they use them. What I worry about is, as you say, that they might go to their GP and other things aren't investigated. If they're just a certain age and they have a certain cluster of symptoms, they're just given hormones without any advice about the importance of liver health. A lady using hormones, taking hormones, and still drinking a bottle of wine a day, it's almost negligent from a medical perspective because of the impact that alcohol has, especially on estrogen metabolism. Well, I wrote a book called Fix Iron First, The One Thing That Changes Everything. And one of the reasons I gave that book that title was I was seeing so many women go into their perimenopause transition so depleted of iron, and that wasn't even being measured or assessed or addressed to see if that improved some of the symptoms that the person thought was related to changing hormones. I'm not saying that's going to fix it for everyone, but that's just an example of ways we can get significant improvement in quality of life, in energy, reduction in anxious feelings, better sleep, better thyroid function, just with that one nutrient alone. So a woman facing that time in her life and curious about hormones, it might be the right road for you, but please don't do that at the expense of not addressing what might be there. So a batch of blood tests is very, very helpful. I always want to fix what's gone awry in the person, whether it's insulin resistance or lousy thyroid function, whatever it is.
Do you think a decent number of women are seeing their GP and bloods aren't being done, and it's something that we need to ask for, essentially?
Yes.
And it seems today that there's so much more access to individualized medicine, individualized testing, and yet it sounds like we as consumers still need to drive that or steer that a little bit. Are there best practices around making sure we're getting closer to the information we need to make the best decisions for our health?
If someone who loves blood tests, I think we need to have great respect for our GPs because they're so stretched for time. They're under a lot of pressure to do minimal testing. So it's not them, it's the system really that the challenge. And if you're someone who wants a lot of blood tests done, the word integrative is the word to look for. So an integrative doctor is usually trained in nutritional and environmental medicine as well as having done their medical degree, and they usually will do more blood testing. The other option is that you pay for the blood tests yourself, because that then takes the pressure off your doctor getting into trouble for doing testing that they're often not allowed to do. So offering to pay for the blood test can also be very helpful. And then there are some functional labs starting to pop up where you can just arrange the tests yourself. The trouble with those is you need a well-educated, very experienced person to interpret the results for you. I worry that someone who doesn't have knowledge about how to read blood tests gets a copy of their blood tests and has a panic about something that they don't need to worry about, or that something could get missed. So it's finding the person to work with if you do it yourself. I still prefer for people to see a health professional who organises the blood test for you and then can talk you through the results so that you can then action what might need addressing.
Yeah, it makes sense. I tried a service in the States recently with my mother where they offer 100 tests. It's like they know nothing about you. There's no background. There's no symptoms. Anyone can basically sign up and get 100 tests. I think it's all blood, if not all blood and urine. And one of the things that kind of struck me about that was the sort of the shotgun style of it. It's not at all prescribed. It's kind of like, let's just take an assessment of all of these different metrics. And we did find interesting things. And there were some things that were, out of norm. And I thought it was valuable, actually, but it was missing that next layer of interpretation and of integration of the information into lifestyle or next steps. It's interesting. I mean, it's nice that we have access to all of these choices these days, and I agree with you. Integrative or functional medicine is a great place to start. Tell me more about iron. So you mentioned that there's a type of iron that women should be looking for. Give me a sense of what percentage of middle-aged women are facing iron deficiency.
A study was done in New Zealand. Up to 55% of women are
Oh,
affected by
wow.
some degree of iron deficiency. So it's major. Our
Massive.
requirements, yeah, it is. Across the menstruation years, we need 18 milligrams of iron per day just to prevent deficiency. And some women have issues with absorption, but some are simply not eating enough iron-rich foods. And iron, just like other nutrients in the body, iron doesn't work on its own. It needs copper and it needs vitamin A to be able to go where it needs to go in the body. So sometimes it's an iron problem, sometimes it's a problem with those other nutrients, sometimes it's all of it. But a lot of women don't eat enough iron, and the old school supplements are very constipating and cause all sorts of problems for a lot of people and often don't improve iron status very well. But there's a new generation of supplements, and for full transparency, I've created one called Iconic Iron, but the iron is actually sourced from organic peas. So it's made from food, and the type of iron in it is called the type of iron is called ferritin iron. It's contained in all legumes, but it's particularly rich in peas. And if you can imagine that ferritin is like a little protein cage that houses thousands of atoms of iron. And the big difference with ferritin iron is that when we swallow it, it gets through the stomach acid and it arrives at the gut cell, and the gut cell takes it in whole. So it's absorbed through a process that has a fancy name called receptor-mediated endocytosis. So the gut cell actually engulfs the ferritin cage that contains the iron. And the beautiful thing with that absorption mechanism that's unique to ferritin iron is the gut cell is not exposed to free iron, because free iron, which the gut cell will be exposed to free iron if we have those old school iron supplements. Free iron drives inflammation, oxidative stress, and it can be a big reason why women get, or people get, those gut-related symptoms from those old school iron supplements. Whereas with ferritin iron, you bypass all of that and it overcomes those absorption issues. So, yeah, we're getting extraordinary results. People write to us, my ferritin was 14, and which is their iron storage. And after 2 months of Iconic Iron, it's 43. So there's some big improvements. So it was 8 years of research and development, because anything I do it with food. So it was very tricky, a very long-winded experience to create that, but very rewarding.
Do you use yourself as inspiration, or is it mostly your clients? Like, I'm just wondering, like, are you experimenting with all the latest longevity trends? And I mean, are you somebody who tries everything and is kind of exploring in that way? Or is it more through your work or your research, or where does your inspiration come from?
I just feel really lucky that I get to have a turn on earth. Yeah. I'm not into hacks. Nature is my North Star. Yeah, I sometimes can hardly speak when I even just looking out the window, I can see my big favorite tree. And I am in absolute awe that I get to be here and have this experience. So I'm not into longevity protocol. I don't even think like that. However long I'm here, I just feel so lucky that I get this experience. And it's not even a conscious, I must do this and I must do this to look after myself. A long time ago, I had all sorts of rules for myself that I needed to follow, and I realized that was fear. It wasn't actually health. It wasn't actually coming from health and gratitude. It was fear. And so I trust myself. That's probably the biggest difference now. If something arises and I feel called to go and do something, then I do that. So if whatever it is, whether it's a trend or acupuncture is something I love, and I go through patches where I'll do it every 2 weeks and then I won't do it for ages. But if that arises, I just trust myself and I go with that, whatever it is. So it's like a constant dialogue with life itself. And I just trust that, and I trust the unfolding of that.
I think what I'm really sensing and hearing is that it's kind of like, it's like heart, spirit, and intuition first. And then, of course, you've got this, beautiful academic mind that also, carries and does so much. How does the word spirituality show up in your life? What does that mean to you? When you hear the word spirituality, if you were to kind of interpret from your own experience, how does that show up?
Again, not in a conscious way. It's just part of life. It's part of how I live. I have a distinction between spirituality and soul. Energetically, spirit is up and soul is down for me. Soul is very grounding for me, and spirituality is more connection to everything and recognizing that we're not separate from anything or anyone. It's in how I live rather than conscious practices, or it's in my awareness. I bring it to every interaction I have, whether that interaction is with something in nature, another human, it's always present.
Yeah.
A life without it or awareness of that for me would be very incomplete.
Beautifully said. I was also picturing that moment of your favorite tree and, you're looking out the window at your favorite tree. Those little grounding moments, we align, I would say, in terms of that perspective. So you're speaking my language.
Yeah, I can feel the alignment with that sort of, I guess, acknowledgement of things you've said and I've learnt things from you. Things have crystallized in my mind, particularly the distinctions between discipline and habit. Thank you so much.
What
you
a
can
treat.
Feel
Nice to receive that as well. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for all you've done. You've created a life that really supports others. And I've really enjoyed following your work and look forward to following you further and maybe one day having you over for a visit.
That would be so special. Thank you. Thank you for all you've created and all the ways you care, Damian, and for this beautiful chat.
Okay, my friends, thanks so much for tuning in to the Adventures in Wellbeing. Follow us on any platform you enjoy listening on. And remember, sometimes maybe the most radical thing we can do is just to slow down, to sit, to tune in, and to let go. Much love.